G'day, it's the tax champion here, just about to step onto my high horse, and it's all about how powerful the banks are. So you probably know how powerful the banks are, don't you? If not, I'd like to go through a couple of little stories here about the power of the banks, my opinion of them, and how they control a lot of stuff that's going on in the economy. So GFC, talking GFC 2007, 2008, and of course in the US, essentially the GFC, the global financial crisis, happened because property over there, in particular residential property, loans were being given out by all sorts of banks and financial institutions in the US to people who really couldn't afford them, and it was rife. It messed up the whole of the banking system, and we had that cascading in the world, and the global financial crisis happened, and of course property prices in the US dropped considerably, and they're only just recovering over the last sort of 18 months in America in 2017 and 2018. Yep, a full decade later. Had the Aussies get through it? And we did get through it. The government many years ago set up APRA, the Australian Prudential and Regulation Authority. And APRA was a stroke of genius by the government at the time, and those boffins and Poindexters who set all that up. It was a stroke of genius because APRA locked in certain conditions that the Australian banks had to operate under, and in particular the big four banks were a lot more restricted in their lending practices than what the bigger banks in the US were doing, and so their lending practices were a lot stricter, and a lot of the smaller banks and financiers through the GFC fell over, and the big four, ANZ, NAB, CBA and Westpac, came through it. Our property market did not implode like in the US, and we made it through. And at a macro level, APRA and the big four banks in Australia is absolutely fantastic. Has kept this country really going well. But let's take it down to another level. Us in small business land, and me as a small business tax accountant, we see a lot of things that happen. And I want to take you back further to a client that I was dealing with in the late 90s. So I know I'm winding back a long way here, but about 1997, there was what was called in those times the Asian currency crisis. So there was a number of Asian countries where their currency went straight through the floor. And during that time, again, the property prices held pretty well through that period in Australia. However, when the Asian crisis hit, these banks, these top four banks, have people right at the top, and I'm sure they're absolute Poindexters. Most of them are OCD, most of them are super smart, and then you've got the full corporate people right up the top. And what they do during times of crisis, or even impending times where things are going to be difficult, what they do is, in these big banks, they just draw a line and say anyone that they think is a risk at lending, they're just going to call in and make sure they put the pressure on them, and if that small business messes up, they'll just drag the rug out from under them. So I had a great little client at that time in the Asian currency crisis in the late 90s. He had a fair bit of capital equipment on finance, and he had some other bank overdraft lending as well. Business was going beautifully. The Asian currency crisis hit, and what happened? The big bank right up the top called him in. What they do is they say to the next level down of banker, hey, go out and see Mr. Smith, because Mr. Smith is slightly highly geared and we want him hammered. We want figures every single month. We cannot see his business go down, because if it does go down, they will just go whoosh and take the rug out from under him. That is what happens because our banking industry is so strong at the top and they're so risk averse, they will come into those small business and just pull the rug out from under them. And you've got to be aware of it. Now we get to the current day. I've got another really good example. What's happening at the moment is there's a very, very good chance, and who knows, but I'm just telling you because this gets influenced by the bank, that the political landscape at the federal level is changing. here in Australia, and it's looking like the ALP in a few months' time might get in federally. And they have threatened some restrictions in taxation laws, potentially around a number of areas, which right at the moment is scaring the banks a bit. So what do? And they've done it to one of our clients last week. The big boys in town get down to these business bankers and they say to them, listen, these clients at this level of lending and this level of operations, etc., we're going to keep an eye on them. We want all their information and we want it now, because we're going to hammer them, because if the laws change, they're going to be under the pump. So I get this call last week, don't I, from a business banker at one of the big four. And this fella is an absolute ripper. He's a real guy because he's at the middle area of the bank and he's dealing with real people. And he's got the message from the top, from the Poindexters and all the people who use all the computers in the banks. And he's been told to ring our client and hammer them on, we want the figures in. What's the situation with all of your lending? And he is absolutely hammering them. And the risk we can see with the big banks is the change of taxation laws that may impact a number of small businesses out there, and the banks are acting already. So our client's banker gets the message from way above from the big bank, and they've hammered him and said, we want all of these things off the client. And this banker, funny guy, he says, just calm the farm. Calm the farm? I said to him, mate, where'd you get calm the farm? And he said, mate, I've got a couple of teenage kids. And I said, well, I've got a couple of teenage kids as well, but we're still using Cool the Jets. And he said, Cool the Jets? I've never heard of Cool the Jets. And I said, well, I've never heard of calm the farm, but at the end of the day, up above, they are making the farm uncalm, meaning they're hammering, absolutely hammering our client around what their finances are looking like, the operations of their business, and the client will stay under the pump as we lead up to the election, because the big bank, they know where risk is. They come down to the next level, at the business banking level, and they can hammer small business. So if you get anything out of listening to this, it is the banks at the macro level in Australia are absolutely fantastic. They keep things on track. But if you're at the small business level and you're any sort of a risk, they don't care. They couldn't care less. They will pull that rug from underneath you if things get risky. And right at the moment, in November 2018, it's a little shaky. Property market's corrected a little bit. Is there going to be a change of government? Are they going to really shake up the tax laws in some of these businesses? It's all a little bit uncertain. So if you're getting hammered from your bank, it's coming from way above.